So there's a study done in the early 90s in the UK, and it basically tracked cultural practice on the continuum, and they put amateur on one end and professional on the other. And you can do this for individual artists, and you can do it for companies as well, and you can do it, I think, for theater cultures generally, or arts cultures generally. And so they came up with a number of points, and you can kind of rate where you happen to be in a certain moment in your career, for example, or where a company is. And so they looked at, for one thing, income as one of the differences, right? So if you're making millions of dollars a year and you're a Hollywood star, and then that's one reason to say that you're highly professional, because you can make a career out of it, right? That you always have and will always have continuous work, and you're being well paid for it. And the other end of the continuum is not being paid at all. In fact, I would say that you can go farther than that and say you're paying to do the work in one way or another. So, while I was here as artistic director, as a volunteer position, certainly in those days when I drove to Walterdale, it's gas money, So, in that sense, it's financially speaking, it's a loss, right? So you can kind of chart where you are in that continuum, and there's all sorts of possibilities in between. Sometimes you're paid, sometimes you're not. Another one is career aspirations. So what do you intend to do, right? So, and I've already sort of mentioned it, but some people, they're interested maybe once and twice in doing theater, and then that's all they do, or they have a 9-to-5 job, but they've always done shows, as much as they can over decades, and but they've never had an intention of becoming a professional actor, designer, director. They're just deeply interested in doing it. And that's one end, and the other side of the spectrum on that, of course, is that yes, from the moment you're born, you've decided you will be a professional actor, a professional theater practitioner, and these sorts of things change, obviously year by year. Sometimes you're convinced you will be professional soon, and then other times, and then maybe a few years later you decide, no, it's not actually really for me. So career aspiration is an important factor as well. Also, the sorts of work that you're doing, and it's a bit of a tricky one, but it has to do with, are you doing kind of those traditional musicals, or the Gilbert and Sullivans, and some of the sorts of plays that often get characterized as, they're great plays, but they sometimes get characterized as plays that are done by amateur theaters. And if you go through Music Theatre International, the book where basically if you're looking for what musical you're going to put on in next season, you go through Music Theatre International, for example, and they have their own section for community theatre plays. And they can, in fact, and sometimes those editions, if they're specifically for community theatre, will actually lay out exactly every requirement right down to the props, what you need. It's sort of a how-to. So there's those sorts of plays, and then there's other plays that people think, oh no, an amateur theatre can never handle that. These sort of weighty, epic plays, And Walterdale has occasionally handled those sorts of plays, or Shakespeare, for example. Who wants to touch Shakespeare unless you have a lot of experience? Well, Walterdale at this point, I think, has done 6 or 7 Shakespeares during its 50 years, and a number of them being very acclaimed, and memorable productions. So. So that's sort of the sort of fare that you're doing. Right? Another one, and I think this is probably the most important one, or one of the most important ones, at least in my mind, and that is how does the society look at, how do they view that particular art? How does society view that particular art? So if you're, so where does theater stand? How important is theater in the cultural fabric at this point? Right? And this is different from city to city, and it's different from country to country, in different cultures. Sometimes theater, never heard of it, never seen it, no interest in it. Maybe I've read a play, but in other cultures, in other cities and arts cultures, you'll find that. Theater is very important. It's one of the most important art forms. It's a communal experience. You go to have a similar experience. You go to the theater to have a similar experience with people around you. You go with friends. Social action theater. You go to as political protest, for example. All sorts of performance that can happen, and it's a real society builder and a culture builder. So there's a real range in there too, and so cultures that view theater highly will have professions that run maybe comparatively more smoothly, and that you're looked upon as an artist as a professional, right? But in other places, you say, "Oh, I'm a professional theater artist," and people will sort of say, "Oh, you know, what's that? What does that mean? What does that mean? Oh, you're an artist. You like to put on plays sometimes, you know. But so there's a real continuum, and it really depends where you are locally. And so in Edmonton, for example, this is, I think, theater artists are generally highly viewed, very well, you know, very well thought of here. So. So there's this sort of number of factors, and you can kind of chart it, and they can change year by year, whether it's a company or an artist. But I think it's important to look at because it's not cut and dry. I think it's not. You know, I think people sort of realize this, but it's often sort of hard to articulate. But that, you know, you can. It's not a question of are you professional or are you not. We used to say at Walterdale, and I'm sure I know they still do, is that you have to come in with a very professional attitude by virtue of the fact that there isn't a capital P profession to sort of back up your work in case you falter or in case you're not reaching the bar that you've set, you know, and that your fellow artists here have set. That there's a real you need to have a real professionalism because everybody's time is volunteer time here. You can't waste other people's time. Quite simply, and you need to come in with a serious professional attitude. So this is one of the. So that to me is sort of how you do your work. So I've always said here at Walterdale that for the most part, there's a real professional attitude toward doing non-professionalized work. Right? So I kind of look at there's a profession, a disciplined, regimented profession, and then around that are theaters like Walterdale that are working outside of that, but with a very strong understanding of what that profession is and an understanding of where where Walterdale fits in and where it overlaps some of the professional work, but where it also is very much outside of an actors' equity disciplinary regime, and often for better. And in fact, there's moments in Walterdale's history when Walterdale has, you know, seriously considered going professional, you know, and becoming an equity house. But in all those times it said no because it felt that its niche here was to support local talent. There's different reasons at different moments, but often it's local talent. And really saying that Walterdale can best support the profession by staying outside of the profession to train potential professionals later. And also to offer sort of an alternative to audiences to say, this is what human beings can do when you get together in your community. That's really always, it's almost always been the point of doing theater, is to come together and have a communal experience because it's a communal art form. And that is possible outside of a profession. You know, as long as you're maybe not going to devote your career to doing it.